The gunshot echoed through the valley like thunder, sending a flock of startled crows into the dimming sky as Madeline Foster clutched her young son to her chest and ran. The year was 1875, and the untamed wilderness of Wyoming territory had never felt more dangerous or more like her only hope of survival. "Mama, I'm scared," 6-year-old Thomas whispered, his small body trembling against hers as they huddled beneath the ancient cottonwood tree. The spring night was growing colder with each passing minute, and Madeline had nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever she'd managed to stuff into a small satchel before fleeing. "I know, my brave boy," she whispered back, pressing her lips to his forehead, "but we must be quiet now. Like the game we play, remember? Silent as church mice." She forced a smile despite the terror that threatened to consume her. Her husband was dead murdered before her eyes by men who wouldn't stop until they found her too. She was the only witness to their crime, and in a territory where law was often as wild as the land itself, that made her a walking death sentence. 3 days they'd been running, sleeping in abandoned barns and dense thickets, surviving on the few provisions she'd grabbed and whatever berries she recognized as safe. But Thomas was growing weaker, his cheeks hollowing and his usual energy fading. They needed shelter, food, and help, things that seemed as distant as the stars now twinkling above them in the fading light. She spotted smoke rising in thin wisps above the trees about a mile ahead. A homestead, perhaps, or a trap. "Thomas," she whispered, brushing his dark hair from his eyes, "we're going to walk just a little further and then maybe we can rest properly. Can you be strong for Mama?" The boy nodded solemnly, his eyes too old for his young face. Like Pa was strong, the question stabbed at her heart. "Yes, sweetheart, just like Pa." They moved cautiously through the gathering darkness, the distant curl of smoke their only beacon. As they drew closer, Madeline could make out the silhouette of a modest cabin, sturdy and well-built, with a small corral containing 2 horses. A lantern glowed in the window, casting a warm square of light onto the hard, packed earth outside. It could be salvation or damnation. But Thomas needed warmth and food, and Madeline was desperate enough to risk it. "Stay hidden behind those bushes," she instructed her son, pointing to a dense thicket about 50 yards from the cabin. "If anything happens, if you hear me scream, or if strange men come, you run into the woods and hide like we practiced." "No, Mama," Thomas protested, gripping her skirt with small, dirty fingers. "I want to stay with you." "This is how you help me most," she insisted, kneeling to meet his eyes. "I'll be right back, I promise." With reluctance, the boy concealed himself in the brush, and Madeline approached the cabin, each step feeling like she was walking to her own execution. 20 feet from the door, a twig snapped beneath her boot, and the cabin door swung open with alarming speed. Madeline froze, heart hammering against her ribs as a tall figure filled the doorway, shotgun raised. "That's far enough," a deep voice commanded. "State your business." She raised her hands slowly. "Please, sir, I'm alone and in need of help. My son and I, your son." The man interrupted, his stance shifting slightly as he scanned the darkness beyond her. "Where is he?" Before Madeline could answer, a small voice called out, "Don't hurt my mama." Thomas had disobeyed, emerging from his hiding place to stand defiantly between the stranger and his mother, tiny fists clenched at his sides. Madeline moved swiftly to place herself between Thomas and the shotgun, but to her surprise, the man lowered his weapon. In the spill of lantern light, she could see his face now weathered and sun-browned, with piercing blue eyes beneath a shock of dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a trimmed beard and the lean, hard look of someone who knew the land and its harshness intimately. The man's expression softened as he looked at Thomas, then back at Madeline. He set the shotgun against the doorframe and stepped onto the porch. "I reckon you two look half-starved and wholly exhausted," he said, his voice gentler now. "Come inside before you catch your death." Madeline hesitated, years of hard-learned caution warring with desperation. The man seemed to read her thoughts. "Madam, I understand your wariness. These parts aren't always kind to those traveling alone, but I promise you're safe here." He paused, then added, "My name's Zachary Taylor. Most folks just call me Zach." Thomas, with the impulsiveness of a child, stepped forward before Madeline could stop him. He stared up at the tall stranger with a mixture of fear and hope. "Are you a real cowboy, mister?" he asked. A smile cracked across Zachary's face, transforming his stern features. "Born and raised on horseback, young man, and you are Thomas Foster," the boy answered proudly, "and that's my mama." Zachary nodded respectfully toward Madeline. "Mrs. Foster." "Miss," she corrected automatically, then regretted giving away even that small piece of information. "I mean, no need to explain," Zachary interrupted softly. "Not tonight anyway. Come in, both of you. I've got stew on the fire and plenty to share." Thomas looked back at his mother, silently pleading. The smell of cooking food now reached them, making Madeline's empty stomach clench painfully. She gave a small nod, and Thomas immediately bounded up the porch steps with renewed energy. As the boy passed him, Zachary placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You found the right stranger, kid," he said with quiet sincerity. "Now let's get some food in you." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly orderly and clean. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, illuminating a main room with a small wooden table, 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the fire. A curtain partially concealed what appeared to be a sleeping area. On the walls hung a few tools, a rifle, and surprisingly, several shelves of books. "Please sit," Zachary gestured to the table as he moved to the hearth, where a cast iron pot hung over the flames. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." Madeline guided Thomas to one of the chairs, keeping him close as her eyes darted to the windows and door, calculating escape routes. Zachary noticed but said nothing as he ladled thick stew into 3 wooden bowls and placed them on the table along with a loaf of bread that looked surprisingly fresh. "Baking day," he explained, catching her glance at the bread. "Lucky timing for you both." Thomas didn't wait for permission, diving into the food with the desperate hunger of a child who'd missed too many meals. Madeline wanted to caution him to slow down but found herself doing the same, the rich flavor of meat and vegetables overwhelming her senses. "Thank you," she managed between bites, her suspicion temporarily overwhelmed by gratitude. Zachary sat across from them, eating more slowly. "Been on the road long?" he asked casually. Madeline tensed. "A few days. Heading anywhere in particular?" "West," she answered vaguely. "Perhaps California." Zachary nodded, not pressing further. "That's a hard journey, especially with a young one." "We'll manage," Madeline said with more confidence than she felt. Thomas, his initial hunger satisfied, looked around the cabin with open curiosity. "Are you all alone, Mr. Taylor?" "Thomas," Madeline admonished softly. "It's a fair question," Zachary replied with a small smile. "Yes, son, it's just me. My wife passed on 4 years back. Fever took her." A shadow crossed his face. "Been just me and the horses since then." "My pa died too," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "Bad men shot him." "Thomas," Madeline gasped, horrified. Zachary's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Is that so?" he asked carefully, looking from the boy to Madeline. She felt the weight of his gaze and knew she needed to say something. "My husband was killed 3 days ago," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We had to leave quickly." "These bad men," Zachary said slowly, "they still looking for you?" Madeline hesitated, then nodded once. "There was no point lying about that." "I see," Zachary replied. He didn't ask for details, which surprised her. Instead, he rose and moved to a small cupboard, returning with a jar of honey which he placed before Thomas. "A little sweet after your meal, young man. Just a spoonful, mind." Thomas's eyes lit up as Zachary offered him a spoon, and Madeline felt a rush of gratitude for this small kindness. "You both need rest," Zachary said as Thomas happily licked honey from the spoon. "You can take the bed tonight. I'll sleep out here by the fire." "We couldn't possibly," Madeline began. "You can and you will," Zachary interrupted firmly. "No offense, madam, but you look about ready to collapse, and the boy's dead on his feet despite that honey perking him up." As if to prove his point, Thomas yawned widely, his eyelids drooping. "Just for tonight," Madeline conceded reluctantly, "and we'll be gone at first light." Something flickered in Zachary's eyes, disappointment perhaps, but he simply nodded. "As you wish. There's a wash basin behind the curtain if you'd like to clean up. I'll tend to the fire." After they'd washed a luxury that nearly brought tears to Madeline's eyes, she tucked Thomas into the surprisingly comfortable bed. The boy was asleep, almost instantly, his small body finally relaxing after days of tension and fear. Madeline sat on the edge of the bed, watching him breathe, wondering how they'd come to this moment of precarious safety in a stranger's home. The curtain that separated the sleeping area from the main room was drawn, but she could hear Zachary moving about, banking the fire for the night. She should have been terrified, sleeping in an unknown man's cabin miles from anywhere. But something about Zachary Taylor inspired trust, despite her best efforts to remain wary. Perhaps it was the way he'd spoken to Thomas, or the simple kindness of offering them shelter without demanding explanations. Or perhaps, she thought wearily, she was simply too exhausted to maintain her guard any longer. With that troubling thought, Madeline lay down beside her son, one arm protectively around him, and surrendered to sleep. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee. Madeline woke with a start, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous night came rushing back. Thomas still slept soundly beside her, his cheeks flushed with healthy color for the first time in days. Carefully, she rose and peered through a gap in the curtain. Zachary stood at the stove, his back to her, preparing what appeared to be breakfast. He moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to caring for himself, and there was something oddly compelling about watching him in this unguarded moment. He must have sensed her gaze because he turned suddenly, catching her eye through the curtain gap. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Sleep well?" Madeline stepped out, smoothing her rumpled dress self-consciously. "Better than I have in a long while," she admitted. "Thank you. Coffee's hot," he offered, gesturing to a pot on the stove. "And there's eggs almost ready." "I meant what I said about leaving this morning," Madeline said, accepting the cup of coffee he poured for her. "We've imposed enough." Zachary leaned against the counter, studying her with those intense blue eyes. "Where exactly do you plan to go, Mrs. Foster?" "Miss," she corrected again. "And as I said, west, on foot, with no provisions, with men hunting you." Each question was delivered calmly but hit with the precision of arrows. Madeline set her cup down with a sharp click. "We have no choice." "There's always a choice," Zachary replied. "I'm offering you one now. Stay here at least for a few days. Rest, gather your strength, let me help you figure out what comes next." "Why would you do that?" Madeline asked suspiciously. "You don't know us." "I know enough," Zachary said simply. "I know you're a mother protecting her child. I know you're running from something dangerous, and I know that if you leave today, your chances aren't good." Madeline wanted to argue, but the truth of his words stung. "We'll bring danger to your door," she said softly. "My door's seen danger before," he replied with a half-smile. "I can handle myself." Before she could respond, Thomas emerged from behind the curtain, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Mama, are we leaving?" The hope in his voice when he asked made her decision for her. "Not just yet, sweetheart. Mr. Taylor has invited us to stay a little longer." Thomas's face broke into a wide grin. "Can I see the horses?" Zachary chuckled. "After breakfast, young man, a growing boy needs his food first." They ate together at the small table, and for the first time since her husband's murder, Madeline felt the knot of tension in her chest begin to loosen. It was temporary. She knew danger still lurked beyond these walls, but for this moment, in this cabin with the morning sun streaming through the windows, she allowed herself to breathe. After breakfast, true to his word, Zachary took Thomas out to meet the horses, a sturdy brown gelding named Buck and a dappled gray mare called Silver. From the window, Madeline watched as her son's face lit up with joy when Zachary lifted him onto the mare's back and led them slowly around the corral. It was a simple moment of childhood delight, something Thomas had been denied these past terrible days. The sight of his laughter, of his small hands patting the horse's neck with wonder, brought tears to Madeline's eyes. "He's a natural," Zachary commented when they returned, Thomas chattering excitedly about how high up he'd been and how soft the horse's mane felt. "His father would be pleased to hear that," Madeline said quietly. Then, surprising herself, she added, "William loved horses. He worked at the livery in Utica before we had to leave." It was the first personal detail she'd offered, and Zachary seemed to recognize its significance. He nodded thoughtfully. Utica's a fair piece from here, nearly 2 days' hard ride. We didn't come directly, Madeline admitted. We took a roundabout route. Smart, Zachary commented, makes you harder to track. The casual way he said it reminded Madeline that this man was more than just a kind stranger. He understood survival in these harsh lands. Mr. Taylor, she began hesitantly. Zach, he corrected. If you're staying under my roof, even temporarily, I'd prefer you use my given name. Zach, she repeated, the informal address feeling strange on her tongue. I feel I should explain more about our situation, about why we're running, he shook his head. Not necessary, not unless telling me would ease your burden. Madeline studied him, trying to read the intentions behind his words. In her experience, men always wanted something in return for their kindness. Yet Zachary Taylor seemed different somehow. Perhaps another time, she said finally. He accepted this with a nod. Fair enough. Now I've got work to do around the place. Thomas, would you like to help me feed the chickens? Can I, Mama? Thomas asked eagerly. Madeline smiled despite herself. Yes, but mind Mr. Taylor, Zach, and do as he tells you. As the day progressed, Madeline found herself gradually lowering her guard. Zachary was a man of routine and simple purpose, going about his chores with quiet efficiency, teaching Thomas small tasks along the way. He treated the boy with respect, answering his endless questions with patience and occasional humor. By midday, Thomas was following Zachary like a shadow, his small face serious as he attempted to mimic the man's movements and carry tools that were often too heavy for him. Zachary never laughed at these efforts, instead adjusting tasks to suit the boy's abilities, praising his help with genuine appreciation. Wanting to contribute, Madeline took over the kitchen, preparing a simple meal from Zachary's surprisingly well-stocked pantry. As she worked, she found herself wondering about this solitary man. The cabin, while spare, had touches that spoke of care: the books on the shelves, a handmade quilt on the rocking chair, dried wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. These weren't the trappings of the rough men she'd grown accustomed to fearing. When Zachary and Thomas returned for the midday meal, both were dusty and pleased with themselves. We fixed the chicken coop, Mama, Thomas announced proudly. Mr. Zach says I'm a fine carpenter. With a little practice, Zachary added with a wink at Madeline, but he's got good hands and a quick mind. The compliment warmed her, and she found herself smiling back. Lunch is ready if you two workers are hungry. They ate together, the conversation flowing more easily now. Thomas did most of the talking, recounting their morning adventures with dramatic detail, but occasionally Zachary would ask Madeline a question, nothing too personal, just small things about her preferences or opinions. It felt strange, this tentative normality. Like playing house in a world that had stopped making sense. Yet there was comfort in it too, in the simple rhythm of shared meals and honest work. As evening approached, Zachary announced he needed to check his trapline and would be gone for an hour or so. The cabin's secure, he told Madeline as he gathered his rifle. Bar the door behind me, I'll knock 3 times when I return. The concern in his voice touched her. We'll be fine, she assured him, touched by his protectiveness. Once he'd gone, Madeline drew Thomas a bath in a large metal tub, heating water on the stove as her son played with a small wooden horse Zachary had carved for him that afternoon. I like Mr. Zach, Thomas said as she washed his hair. He's nice like Pa was. The comparison made Madeline's chest tighten. Yes, he's been very kind to us. Can we stay here forever, Mama? Thomas asked, looking up at her with hope in his eyes. Madeline sighed, smoothing wet hair from his forehead. No, sweetheart, this isn't our home. We're just guests for a little while. But why can't it be our home? Mr. Zach is all alone and we don't have a house anymore. We could help him and he could help us. The simple logic of children, Madeline thought sadly, if only the world worked that way. It's complicated, Thomas. Now let's get you dried off before you turn into a prune. Later, after Thomas was asleep in Zachary's bed, despite Madeline's protests, he had insisted they take it again. She sat by the fire, lost in thought. The events that had led her here still felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. William hadn't been a perfect husband. He drank too much sometimes, and had a quick temper, but he'd provided for them and, in his way, loved them. His job at the livery in Utica had been steady, and they'd been saving to buy a small place of their own someday. Then came that terrible night when William had stayed late at the saloon and witnessed something he shouldn't have: a murder committed by Jonas Blackwood, son of the wealthiest man in the county, and his cronies. William had rushed home frantic, telling Madeline they needed to report it to the sheriff. But Sheriff Davis was firmly in Elias Blackwood's pocket. Everyone knew that. And when William had insisted on justice, things had quickly spiraled out of control. Jonas and 3 of his friends had come to their home in the dead of night, dragging William outside. Madeline had watched from the window, frozen in terror as they accused him of lying, of trying to blackmail them. William had denied it, begged them to see reason. Jonas had pulled his gun and shot him point blank. They would have killed her too if she hadn't grabbed Thomas and slipped out the back door into the darkness. She'd heard them ransacking the house, heard Jonas shouting that they needed to find her, silence her. She was the only witness now. 3 knocks at the door startled Madeline from her dark memories. She rose quickly, unbarring the door to admit Zachary, who carried a brace of rabbits for tomorrow's meal. "All quiet?" he asked, setting his rifle by the door. "Yes," she answered. "Thomas is already asleep." Zachary nodded, moving to hang his coat by the fire. "Good day for him, I think. Boys his age need open air and purpose." "You're good with him," Madeline observed. "Have you? Did you and your wife have children?" A shadow crossed his face. "No, Emily and I tried, but it wasn't to be. The fever took her before we could start a family properly." "I'm sorry," Madeline said softly. "That must have been very difficult." "It was," he agreed, his voice low. "Still is some days. This cabin gets mighty quiet." He paused, then added, "It's been nice having voices in it again." The simple honesty of the statement touched something in Madeline. "Thank you for taking us in," she said. "I don't know what we would have done if—" "No need for that," he interrupted gently. "Anyone with a heart would have done the same." "No," Madeline shook her head. "Most wouldn't. Most would have turned us away, or worse." Zachary studied her face in the firelight. "You've had reason to distrust people, I can see that. Someday, when you're ready, I'd like to hear what brought you to my door, but only when you're ready." His patience, his lack of demands, was so unexpected that Madeline felt something inside her crumble. To her horror, tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, turning away quickly. "It's been a long few days." She felt his hand on her shoulder, gentle and hesitant. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "Nothing at all." For a moment they stood like that, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress, her tears falling silently. Then, with a deep breath, Madeline composed herself and turned back to face him. "I should get some rest," she said, embarrassed by her display of emotion. Zachary nodded, dropping his hand. "Of course. Sleep well, Madeline." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Good night, Zach," she replied, retreating behind the curtain to where Thomas slept peacefully. As she lay in the darkness, listening to Zachary move quietly around the cabin preparing for sleep, Madeline realized with a start that she felt safe. For the first time since William's murder, the constant fear that had been her companion had receded to a manageable distance. It was dangerous, this feeling. Safety was an illusion, especially now. Yet as sleep claimed her, Madeline couldn't help but surrender to it just for tonight. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Zachary went about his usual work, tending to the horses, checking traps, repairing things around the property with Thomas as his eager apprentice. Madeline took over the domestic duties, cooking and cleaning, mending some of Zachary's clothes that needed attention. It was an arrangement that evolved naturally, without discussion, and Madeline found herself enjoying the simple routine. There was peace in this isolated cabin, a reprieve from the terror that had driven her here. On the 3rd day, while Thomas was helping Zachary in the barn, Madeline discovered a trunk in the corner of the bedroom. Curiosity overcame her, and she carefully opened it to find women's clothing, simple but well-made dresses, a shawl, a bonnet. Emily's things, preserved by a grieving husband. She closed the trunk quickly, ashamed of her intrusion, but when Zachary returned for the midday meal, she felt compelled to mention it. "I found your wife's trunk," she admitted. "I shouldn't have looked, but it's all right," he interrupted, his expression softening. "They're just things now." Emily would have wanted them used rather than gathering dust. Madeline hesitated, then said, "I've been wearing the same dress for days now. If you truly wouldn't mind, perhaps I could." "Please," Zachary nodded. "Take whatever you need for both of you." With his permission, Madeline altered one of Emily's dresses to fit her slimmer frame and fashioned a new shirt for Thomas from another. When she emerged from the bedroom the next morning in the blue calico dress, Zachary's eyes widened slightly before he quickly looked away. "Suits you," he said gruffly, busying himself with the coffee pot. Thomas was less restrained in his approval. "Mama, you look pretty," he exclaimed, "like when we used to go to church." The compliments made her cheeks warm, and she realized it had been a long time since she'd felt anything approaching feminine. Survival had consumed her so completely that she'd forgotten such simple pleasures. As the first week stretched into a second, Madeline found herself watching Zachary when he wasn't aware the way his hands, strong but surprisingly gentle, worked with wood or leather. How his face relaxed when he read by firelight in the evenings, the rare but transformative smile that appeared when Thomas said something particularly endearing. She told herself it was natural to be curious about the man who had saved them, nothing more. But sometimes, when their hands accidentally brushed or when she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, Madeline felt something stir within her that had nothing to do with gratitude. It was on the 10th day that everything changed. Thomas had developed a slight cough, nothing serious, but enough that Zachary had insisted the boy stay inside for the day. Madeline was preparing a honey and herb remedy when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Zachary, who had been chopping wood outside, appeared at the door immediately, his face tense. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. "Get Thomas and go to the root cellar." Why?" Madeline asked, though fear was already coiling in her stomach. "Just a precaution," Zachary assured her, but she saw him check his revolver before slipping it into his belt. "There's a trapdoor under the rug by the pantry. Stay quiet until I come for you." The urgency in his voice propelled Madeline into action. She gathered Thomas, who sensed the tension and didn't protest, and quickly found the trapdoor Zachary had mentioned. It led to a small earthen cellar stocked with preserved food and supplies. She pulled the door closed above them just as the sound of riders reached the cabin. In the dim light filtering through the floorboards, Madeline held Thomas close, straining to hear what was happening above. The muffled sound of men's voices reached them, and then Zachary's, calm but guarded. "Afternoon, gentlemen. What brings you out this way?" A deeper voice responded, the words indistinct but the tone authoritative. Madeline's heart raced as she recognized the speaker, Sheriff Davis from Utica. They had found her. Thomas must have sensed her fear because he whispered, "Mama, who is it?" "SHH Love," she soothed, pressing a finger to her lips. "We must be very quiet like mice." Above them, the conversation continued. Zachary's voice remained steady, but Madeline could detect a new tension in it. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," he was saying. "Been just me out here for years, as you well know, Sheriff." "That's so." The sheriff's voice came clearer now, skeptical. "Then you wouldn't mind if my deputies and I have a look around, got reliable information a woman and child passed through these parts." "My home is my own," Zachary replied evenly. "Unless you've got a warrant, I'd appreciate if you'd state your business and move along." There was a pause, and Madeline could imagine the sheriff's expression darkening. Davis was not a man accustomed to being denied. "Now, Taylor," the sheriff said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "I've always considered you a reasonable man. Don't make this difficult. We're looking for witnesses in a murder investigation." "Witnesses or suspects?" Zachary asked, a challenge in his tone. "That's not your concern," the sheriff snapped. "Now, are you going to cooperate, or do we need to do this the hard way?" Madeline closed her eyes, silently willing Zachary to let them search, to not risk himself for her. She wasn't worth it. "I've got nothing to hide," Zachary said finally. but I'd like to see some official documentation of what you're looking for and why. Seems only proper, given you're so far from your jurisdiction." There was a tense silence, then the sheriff's voice again, lower and more threatening. "You're making a mistake, Taylor. If I find out you're harboring fugitives, it'll go badly for you." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" Zachary's voice was cold now. "Take it however you want," the sheriff replied. "We'll be watching this place." The sound of boots on the wooden floor, then the door closing, and finally horses riding away. Madeline remained frozen, holding Thomas tightly, uncertain if it was truly safe to emerge. After what felt like an eternity, the trapdoor opened and Zachary's face appeared, grim but relieved. "They're gone," he said, extending a hand to help them up. For now, once they were back in the cabin, Madeline's legs gave out and she sank into a chair, trembling. "They found us," she whispered. "They'll be back." Zachary knelt before her, his hands steadying on her arms. "Madeline, look at me," he commanded softly. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "I need to know what's happening. Who are these men? Why are they hunting you?" The moment had come. There was no hiding the truth any longer, not when Zachary had put himself at risk for them. With Thomas occupied with his wooden horse by the fire, Madeline told Zachary everything about William witnessing the murder, about Jonah's Blackwood shooting her husband in cold blood, about their desperate flight from Utica. "The Blackwoods practically own Utica and the surrounding county," she concluded. "Jonah's is Elias Blackwood's only son. They'll never let me testify against him. They'll kill me first, and Thomas too, most likely." Zachary listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he stood and paced the small room, thinking. "This changes things," he said finally. "We need to get you somewhere safe, somewhere beyond Blackwood's reach." "There is nowhere," Madeline said, despair washing over her. "His father has connections throughout the territory." "Not everywhere," Zachary countered. "I have a friend in Colorado, a former lawman with no love for corrupt officials. He could help." "Colorado," Madeline repeated, the distance seeming insurmountable. "How would we even get there? They're watching the cabin now." Zachary's expression was resolute. "I know these lands better than any Blackwood man. There are ways they won't expect." He paused, then added more gently, "But we need to move quickly. Pack only what you need. We leave tonight." Madeline caught the word immediately. "You don't think I'd send you off alone, do you?" Zachary asked, a hint of a smile breaking through his serious expression. "I started this when I took you in. I'll see it through." Gratitude and something deeper flooded through Madeline. "I can't ask that of you. You've already risked too much." "You didn't ask," Zachary pointed out. "I'm offering." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Truth is, Madeline, I don't think I could live with myself if I stayed behind, wondering if you and Thomas made it safely." The admission hung between them, weighty with implications neither was ready to voice. Madeline nodded, unable to find words adequate to express what his support meant to her. "Then we'll go," she said simply. The preparations were swift and silent. Zachary gathered provisions, weapons, and maps, while Madeline packed their few belongings and prepared Thomas for the journey ahead. The boy was excited at the prospect of an adventure, too young to fully grasp the danger they faced. As midnight approached, Zachary led them through the darkness to a small clearing behind the barn where the horses waited, already saddled. "Thomas will ride with me on Buck," Zachary explained, helping Madeline mount the gray mare. "Silver's gentle, but follow my lead and stay close." With Thomas secured in front of him, Zachary led them away from the cabin, not along the main trail but through a narrow deer path that wound deeper into the forest. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by but also concealing their movement beneath the canopy of trees. They rode in silence for hours, Zachary occasionally checking behind them but mainly focused on the difficult path ahead. Thomas eventually fell asleep against Zachary's chest, the man's arm securely around the boy's small form. Watching them from atop Silver, Madeline was struck by how natural they looked together, as if Thomas had found a second father in this quiet, determined man who had appended his own life to protect them. Dawn was breaking when Zachary finally called a halt near a small stream. "We'll rest here briefly," he said, carefully dismounting with Thomas still sleeping in his arms. The horses need water and we should eat something. He laid Thomas gently on a bed of pine needles, covering him with a blanket, then helped Madeline down from her horse. Her legs were stiff and sore from the unaccustomed riding, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. Zachary caught her, his hands strong at her waist, steadying her. For a moment they stood very close, her hands resting on his chest, his face just inches from hers. In the pale early light, his eyes were the color of the sky just before dawn, and Madeline found she couldn't look away from them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a question. His hand moved slightly, almost a caress at her waist, and Madeline felt her breath catch in her throat. Then Thomas stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about horses, and the moment broke. Zachary stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'll see to the horses," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "There's jerky and biscuits in my saddlebag when you're hungry." As he moved away, leading the horses to the stream, Madeline pressed a hand to her racing heart, unsettled by the intensity of what had just passed between them. In the midst of fear and flight, something else was growing, something she'd thought herself incapable of feeling again after William's death. It was dangerous, this feeling, a distraction they couldn't afford. Yet as she watched Zachary's tall figure by the water, the early light gilding his profile, Madeline couldn't bring herself to regret it. Their journey continued for days, following obscure trails and crossing rugged terrain that tested both horses and riders. Zachary proved to be an expert guide, finding water when they needed it and game for their meals, always keeping them moving southward toward Colorado. Thomas thrived under the adventure, his earlier cough forgotten in the excitement of learning to help make camp and gather firewood. Each night he fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's journey, while Madeline and Zachary sat by the small, carefully shielded fire, talking in low voices. During these quiet times, with Thomas sleeping nearby, they began to share more of themselves. Zachary told her how he'd come to Wyoming after the war, seeking solitude and a fresh start. How he'd met Emily, the schoolteacher in a small settlement now abandoned, and built the cabin for her with his own hands. How empty his life had felt after her death, until the night a desperate woman and her son had appeared at his door. In turn, Madeline spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her marriage to William at 18, their move west in search of opportunity. She admitted that their marriage had not been perfect. William drank too much when times were hard, and his temper had sometimes frightened her, but he had been Thomas's father, and she had grieved his violent death. "You deserved better," Zachary said quietly one night, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "Both of you did." "Life doesn't much care what we deserve," Madeline replied, poking at the embers with a stick. "It gives what it gives." "Sometimes it gives second chances," Zachary said, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. The words hung between them, pregnant with possibility, neither quite ready to acknowledge what was growing between them on this desperate journey. On the fifth day, as they crested a ridge overlooking a vast valley, Zachary pulled his horse to a stop. "We're close to the Colorado border now," he said, pointing to distant mountains. "Another day's ride, maybe two, and we'll reach my friend's place." Relief washed over Madeline. They had come so far without incident that she'd begun to hope they might have escaped pursuit entirely. That hope was shattered an hour later when Zachary suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. He dismounted quickly, helping Madeline and Thomas down as well. "What is it?" Madeline whispered, fear clutching at her throat. "Riders," Zachary murmured, leading the horses behind a large outcropping of rock. "Could be nothing, but we can't take chances." They crouched behind the rocks, Zachary's arm protectively around Thomas, as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Through a gap in the stones, Madeline caught a glimpse of 4 men on horseback, moving steadily along the trail they had just left. With a jolt of terror, she recognized Sheriff Davis among them. "It's them," she breathed, shrinking back against Zachary, his arm tightened around her. "Stay absolutely still," he whispered. "They haven't seen us yet." For heart-stopping minutes, they remained frozen as the riders drew closer, then passed along the trail below them. One of the men, Jonas Blackwood himself, Madeline realized with horror, paused, scanning the ridge where they hid. For a terrible moment, she thought he was looking directly at them, but then he turned away, following the others down the trail. Only when the riders had disappeared around a bend did Zachary relax slightly. "They're following our trail," he said grimly. "We need to throw them off." "How?" Madeline asked, still trembling from the close call. Zachary's face was set in determined lines. "There's a river about 2 miles east of here. We'll head there, follow it downstream to cover our tracks, then cut back toward the border on a different route." It was a risky plan, adding miles to their journey, but they had no choice. Quickly, they mounted again and set off at a brisk pace toward the river Zachary had mentioned. The detour cost them precious time and energy. By nightfall, Thomas was feverish, his earlier cough returning with alarming force. They made camp in a sheltered ravine, and Madeline held her son close, trying to soothe his labored breathing. "He needs a doctor," she said desperately, as Zachary pressed a cool cloth to the boy's forehead. "The nearest settlement is still a day's ride," Zachary replied, his face tight with concern, "but I know some remedies that might help." He disappeared into the darkness, returning a short time later with several plants. "My mother was part Cherokee," he explained as he prepared a tea from the herbs. "She taught me about healing plants." Through the long night, they took turns holding Thomas, coaxing sips of the bitter tea into him and watching anxiously as his fever rose and fell. By dawn, Madeline was nearly delirious with exhaustion and fear, convinced she would lose her son after coming so far. "He's stronger than you think," Zachary said softly, taking her hand as they watched Thomas sleep restlessly. "Like his mother." His touch anchored her, providing strength when her own was failing. "I can't lose him, Zach," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's everything to me." "I know," Zachary replied, drawing her against his chest. "But you won't lose him, I promise you that." As the sun rose, Thomas's fever finally broke and his breathing eased. The relief was so profound that Madeline wept again, this time from gratitude. Zachary held her through it, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he watched the boy's color return to normal. They rested that day, allowing Thomas to regain his strength. It was dangerous to remain in one place for too long, but pushing on with a sick child was equally risky. Zachary set small traps and returned with rabbits for a hearty stew that Thomas managed to eat a little of, a good sign. That evening, as Thomas slept peacefully for the first time in days, Madeline found Zachary sitting outside their small shelter, keeping watch. "You should rest," she said, settling beside him on a fallen log. "You've barely slept." "I'm fine," he assured her, though the shadows beneath his eyes told a different story. "I'll sleep when we reach Colorado." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Madeline was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling night air. "Zach," she said finally, gathering her courage, "when this is over, if we make it safely to your friend's place, what then?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "That depends on you, Madeline. What do you want?" The question was simple yet profound. What did she want? For so long, mere survival had been her only goal. But now, sitting beside this man who had risked everything for her and Thomas, she found herself wanting more. "I want." She began, then faltered. "I want Thomas to be safe, to have a chance at a good life. And for yourself," Zachary pressed gently. Madeline met his gaze directly. "I want to stop running," she admitted. "I want to find a place that feels like home again." She hesitated, then added quietly, "These past weeks, despite everything, have been the closest I've felt to that in a long time." Something kindled in Zachary's eyes, a warmth that had nothing to do with the campfire nearby. "Madeline," he said, his voice low and intent, "when I saw you standing at my door that night, I never imagined how completely you and Thomas would change my life. That cabin was just a place I existed until you came. You brought it alive again." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I know the timing is all wrong. I know you're still grieving and afraid, but when this is over, if you wanted to, you could come back with me. You and Thomas both. Not as guests, but as family." The word hung between them, filled with hope and possibility. Madeline felt tears gather in her eyes, but these were different from the tears of fear and exhaustion she'd shed so often lately. I think I'd like that, she whispered, her heart racing with a new kind of nervousness. Very much. Zachary's face transformed with a smile that made him look younger, almost boyish in its joy. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned toward her. His lips, when they met hers, were gentle, the kiss a question as much as a declaration. Madeline answered by moving closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady like the man himself. The kiss deepened, becoming a promise between them, a glimpse of the future they might build together if they survived what lay ahead. When they finally parted, Zachary rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. We should get some rest, he said reluctantly. Tomorrow will be a long day. But neither moved immediately, savoring this moment of connection in the midst of danger, this fragile beginning that had somehow blossomed in the most unlikely circumstances. Morning brought renewed determination. Thomas was much improved, his eyes bright and his appetite returning. They set off at dawn, Zachary leading them on a new route that would, he hoped, keep them clear of their pursuers. The landscape began to change as they moved south, the terrain becoming more varied, with steep ravines and dense forests providing both challenge and cover. By midday, they had crossed what Zachary told them was the Colorado border, though there was no marker to indicate it. We're in safer territory now, he explained as they paused to rest the horses. Not completely safe, but Blackwood's influence doesn't extend as far here. The relief was palpable, but Madeline didn't allow herself to fully relax. Not yet, not until they reached the sanctuary Zachary had promised. They were making good progress when disaster struck. As they were crossing a narrow stream, Silver Madeline's mount suddenly reared, startled by a snake in the water. Madeline, caught unprepared, was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the rocky streambed. Pain exploded in her ankle as Zachary leaped from his horse, rushing to her side. Don't move, he instructed, carefully examining her leg. I don't think it's broken, but it's a bad sprain. Mama, Thomas cried, struggling to get down from Buck. Stay put, son, Zachary called to him firmly. Your mother's going to be fine. The injury complicated their journey significantly. Madeline couldn't ride alone, so she had to share Buck with Zachary, Thomas riding Silver on a lead. The changed arrangement slowed their pace considerably, and Madeline could see the concern in Zachary's eyes as the day waned with miles still to cover. We'll have to make camp earlier than planned, he said as the sun began to set. There's a place ahead that should provide good shelter. The place turned out to be an abandoned trapper's cabin, little more than a lean-to really, but it had walls and a roof, luxuries they hadn't enjoyed since leaving Zachary's home. He helped Madeline inside, setting her gently on a rough bench while Thomas explored the small space with interest. It's not much, Zachary apologized, but it's safer than being in the open. It's perfect, Madeline assured him, wincing as she tried to find a comfortable position for her throbbing ankle. Zachary knelt before her, carefully removing her boot to examine the injury again. It's swelling badly, he observed, his fingers gentle on her skin. I'm going to bind it, but you need to stay off it entirely tomorrow. We can't afford to delay, Madeline protested, not with them still searching for us. We can't afford for you to worsen this injury either, Zachary countered firmly. My friend's place is less than a day's ride from here. We'll manage. As he worked on her ankle, binding it with strips torn from a spare shirt, Thomas came to stand beside them, his face serious. Is Mama going to be all right? He asked Zachary. Your Mama is the strongest woman I know, Zachary replied, looking up at the boy with a reassuring smile. She's going to be just fine, and you know what would help her right now. If you could gather some of that dry grass outside for us to sleep on tonight. Thomas nodded eagerly, pleased to have a useful task, and darted outside, staying within sight of the open door. You're good with him, Madeline observed, not for the first time. He trusts you completely. He's a remarkable boy, Zachary said, finishing with her ankle. You've raised him well despite everything. If we make it through this, Madeline said softly, if we go back to your cabin like you suggested, what would that mean for us, Zach, for you and me? He looked up at her, his eyes serious. It would mean whatever you want it to mean, Madeline. I won't pretend I don't have hopes, but I understand if you need time. "And if I don't?" she asked, her heart pounding. "If I already know what I want?" Zachary's expression softened as he understood her meaning. "Then I would ask if I could court you properly, if I could have the chance to be a father to Thomas and a husband to you in time." The directness of it, the simple honesty, moved her deeply. "I would like that," she whispered. "Very much." Their moment was interrupted by Thomas returning with armfuls of dry grass, his face proud at his contribution. Together they prepared a simple meal and made beds of the gathered grass, Thomas falling asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's events. Madeline lay awake longer, her ankle painful but her heart lighter than it had been in months. Beside her, Zachary kept watch, his profile outlined against the moonlight streaming through the cabin's single window. She reached for his hand in the darkness, a silent acknowledgement of what was growing between them, and felt his fingers tighten around hers in response. Morning brought both hope and new challenges. Madeline's ankle was still painfully swollen, making it clear she wouldn't be able to walk. Zachary fashioned a crude crutch from a branch, but it was evident she would need to ride double with him again. They were preparing to depart when Zachary suddenly stiffened, his hand going to his revolver. "Get inside," he ordered quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant trail. "Now." Madeline didn't question him, grabbing Thomas and hobbling back into the cabin as quickly as her injured ankle allowed. Through the window, she saw what had alarmed Zachary riders approaching, 4 of them, moving steadily toward their location. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized Sheriff Davis and Jonas Blackwood among them. Somehow they had picked up the trail again. Zachary entered the cabin, his expression grim. "They've spotted the horses," he said. "There's no time to run." He looked at Thomas, then at Madeline, making a swift decision. "There's a small space under the floorboards in the corner, big enough for you and Thomas. Get in there now." "What about you?" Madeline asked, fear clutching at her heart. "I'll handle them," Zachary said, checking his revolver. "But I need to know you're both safe first." "Zach, no," Madeline protested, clutching his arm. "There are 4 of them. You can't." "I can and I will," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Madeline, listen to me. I've been in worse situations. But I can't focus if I'm worried about you and Thomas being caught in the crossfire." She knew he was right, but the thought of him facing those men alone was unbearable. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. "I promise," he said, then bent to press a swift, fierce kiss to her lips. "Now go, quickly." With Thomas's help, Madeline located the loose floorboards Zachary had mentioned and eased her way into the cramped space beneath, pulling Thomas down beside her. The last thing she saw before Zachary replaced the boards was his reassuring smile, a promise in itself. From their hiding place, they could hear everything: the approaching riders, the creak of saddles as the men dismounted, the heavy tread of boots on the cabin's porch. "Taylor," Sheriff Davis's voice called, "we know you're in there. Come out nice and peaceful-like, and maybe this doesn't have to end badly." "Sheriff," Zachary's voice replied, sounding casual, as if he were greeting an expected visitor. "Bit far from your jurisdiction, aren't you?" "Cut the act, Taylor," another voice growled. Jonas Blackwood, Madeline realized with a shudder. "We know you've got the woman and her brat. Hand them over and we might let you live." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Zachary responded. "I'm just a trapper passing through." There was a tense silence, then the sound of boots on the wooden floor as someone entered the cabin. "Search the place," the sheriff ordered. "They've got to be here somewhere." Madeline held her breath, her arms tight around Thomas, who remained miraculously silent, sensing the danger above. The footsteps moved around the small cabin, uncomfortably close to their hiding place. "Nothing here, Sheriff," a voice reported after a few minutes. "They can't have just vanished," Jonas Blackwood snarled. "Their trail led straight here." "Maybe they moved on already," the sheriff suggested. "Left Taylor behind as a decoy. Or maybe they were never here at all," Zachary said, his voice level. "You're chasing ghosts, gentlemen." "You're lying," Jonas accused. "You've been helping them since the beginning. My father's got witnesses who saw a woman and child near your property." "Your father's got a lot of things," Zachary replied coldly, "including a murderer for a son." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat, then chaos erupted. There was a shout, the sound of a scuffle, and then the deafening report of a gunshot. Madeline bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she heard a body fall heavily to the floor. "You've killed him." Someone exclaimed, not the sheriff or Jonas, one of the other men. "He went for his gun," Jonas replied defensively. "It was self-defense." "The hell it was," the sheriff said, sounding shaken. "This has gone too far, Jonas. I agreed to help find the woman, not murder an innocent man." "He wasn't innocent," Jonas spat. "He was harboring fugitives, and no one's innocent in this, Davis, including you. You're in as deep as I am." "Not like this," the sheriff insisted. "I'm not a killer." "Then you're a fool," Jonas retorted, "and a liability." Another gunshot rang out, followed by a heavy thud and a groan. Madeline pressed her hand over Thomas's mouth, stifling his whimper of fear. "What the hell, Jonas?" One of the remaining men exclaimed. "You just shot the sheriff." "He was turning on us," Jonas said coldly. "Like I said, a liability. Now, are you two with me, or do I need to make the same decision about you?" There was a tense silence, then a mumbled assent from both men. "Good," Jonas said. "Now let's burn this place to the ground. If the woman and her brat are hidden somewhere nearby, the fire will smoke them out." Madeline's heart stopped at the words. She heard movement above, the splash of liquid lamp oil. She realized with horror, and then the distinctive sound of a match being struck. "Let's go," Jonas ordered. "They'll either burn or show themselves. Either way, our problem's solved." The sound of retreating footsteps, then the crackle of flames catching. Smoke began to seep through the floorboards, and Madeline knew they had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the entire cabin was engulfed. She pushed at the floorboards desperately, but they had been replaced too securely. "Zach." She called out, hoping against hope. "Zach, can you hear me?" No response came. The smoke was thickening rapidly, making Thomas cough. With renewed strength born of desperation, Madeline shoved at the floorboards again, and this time they gave way. She emerged into a cabin rapidly filling with smoke and flames. On the floor lay two bodies: Sheriff Davis, bleeding but still alive, his chest rising and falling shallowly, and Zachary, motionless, blood staining his shirt just below his left shoulder. "Zach." Madeline cried, hobbling to his side, her injured ankle forgotten in her panic. She pressed her fingers to his neck, nearly sobbing with relief when she felt a pulse, weak but steady. "Thomas," she called urgently, "come help me. We need to get Mr. Zach out of here." The boy scrambled from the hiding place, his eyes wide with fear as he took in the scene. Is he dead, Mama?" "No, sweetheart, but we need to move quickly," Madeline said, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "The fire is spreading fast." Together, they managed to drag Zachary toward the door, his dead weight almost impossible for a woman with an injured ankle and a small boy to move. The sheriff made a feeble movement as they passed him. "Help me," he gasped. Madeline hesitated, torn between leaving the man who had hunted them and her innate humanity. "Thomas, go outside," she decided quickly. "I'll bring Mr. Zach, and then I'll come back for the sheriff." It took all her strength, but she managed to half-drag, half-carry Zachary out of the burning cabin and a safe distance away. The horses, thankfully, had been spooked by the gunfire but not gone far, tethered as they were. "Stay with him," Madeline instructed Thomas. "I'm going back for the sheriff." "No, Mama," Thomas protested, grabbing her skirt. "He's a bad man. He wanted to hurt us." "Even bad men deserve a chance, Thomas," Madeline said, though part of her agreed with her son. "It's what makes us different from them." Steeling herself, she limped back toward the cabin, now almost fully engulfed in flames. The heat was intense, the smoke choking, but she pushed through the doorway, searching for the sheriff through streaming eyes. She found him where they'd left him, barely conscious. "Come on," she urged, grabbing his arms and pulling with all her might. "You have to help me. I can't do this alone." Whether it was her words or self-preservation, the sheriff managed to gather enough strength to half-crawl, half-stagger with her support toward the door. They emerged from the burning cabin just as the roof began to collapse inward, sending a shower of sparks into the morning air. Madeline helped the sheriff to the ground near where Thomas watched over Zachary. The boy's expression was confused, unable to understand why his mother would risk herself for someone who had pursued them. "Is Mr. Zach going to die?" Thomas asked, his voice small. Madeline knelt beside Zachary, examining his wound more carefully now that they were safe from immediate danger. The bullet had gone through his shoulder, missing vital organs from what she could tell. He'd lost blood, but the wound had begun to clot. "No, sweetheart," she assured her son. "He's very strong, remember, he's going to be fine." She prayed she was right. The sheriff groaned, drawing her attention. His wound was more serious, a chest shot that bubbled ominously with each labored breath. "Why?" he managed to ask, looking at Madeline with genuine confusion. "Why save me?" "Because it was the right thing to do," she answered simply. "And because you might still do the right thing yourself." Understanding dawned in the sheriff's eyes. "Jonas," he whispered. "He's the one. He killed your husband, I knew, but I let it happen. Blackwood's money." He coughed, blood speckling his lips. "I'm sorry." "Tell someone who matters," Madeline said, unmoved by deathbed remorse. "Tell whoever finds you, make it right for my son's sake." The sheriff nodded weakly, then his eyes closed, whether in unconsciousness or death, Madeline couldn't tell. She turned her attention back to Zachary, who was beginning to stir. "Madeline," he mumbled, his eyes flickering open. "Thomas, we're here," she assured him, taking his hand. "We're safe, the cabin." He began, trying to rise and wincing in pain. "Easy," she soothed, pressing him gently back down. "It's gone, but we're alive, and that's what matters." His eyes focused on her face, relief washing over his features. "I thought I'd lost you," he admitted hoarsely. "You promised to be careful," she reminded him, tears stinging her eyes. Getting shot wasn't part of the plan. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Plans change. Are they gone?" Madeline glanced at the sheriff's still form, then at the distant trail where Jonas and his remaining men had fled. "Jonas and 2 of his men rode off. They thought we'd burn in the cabin." "The sheriff is." She looked again, saw no movement in the man's chest. "He's dead." Zachary's expression hardened. "Jonas will be back when he realizes the fire didn't finish the job." "Then we need to move," Madeline said decisively. "Can you ride?" "I'll have to," Zachary replied grimly. With Thomas's help, Madeline managed to bandage Zachary's wound using strips torn from her petticoat. The effort left both her and Zachary pale and sweating, but the bleeding had slowed to a sluggish trickle. Getting him onto Buck was a painful process that left Zachary gray-faced but determined. Thomas rode with Madeline on Silver this time, the mare seeming to understand the need for gentleness as she carried the injured woman and child. They set off as quickly as they dared, leaving the burning cabin and the sheriff's body behind. Zachary led them on a direct route now, no longer concerned with covering their tracks. Speed was more important than stealth. They needed to reach his friend's place before Jonas returned or Zachary's wound worsened. The journey was torturous, each jolt and dip in the trail sending fresh waves of pain through both Zachary's shoulder and Madeline's ankle. Thomas, sensing the gravity of their situation, remained unusually quiet, his small face solemn as he watched Zachary struggle to stay upright in his saddle. By mid-afternoon, Zachary was swaying dangerously, his face flushed with fever. Madeline urged Silver alongside Buck, reaching out to steady him. "Just a little further," she encouraged, though she had no idea if this was true. "You can do this, Zach, stay with us." He nodded weakly, his jaw clenched with determination. "Over that ridge," he managed. "Samuel's place is in the valley beyond." The ridge seemed an impossible distance, but somehow they made it, cresting the top as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Below them lay a neat ranch, a sturdy 2-story house, a large barn, and several outbuildings, all surrounded by well-maintained fences enclosing cattle and horses. "Thank God," Madeline breathed, tears of relief springing to her eyes. "Thomas, look, we've made it." As they started down the slope toward the ranch, a man emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the setting sun to look up at them. He stood watching for a moment, then suddenly broke into a run toward the house, returning moments later with a rifle in hand. "Hold it right there," he called as they approached the fence line. "State your business, Samuel," Zachary called weakly. "It's Zach Taylor." The man lowered his rifle immediately, his stance shifting from defensive to concerned as he took in Zachary's bloodied state. "Good Lord, Zach, what happened to you?" He vaulted the fence and hurried toward them, reaching up to help Zachary down from his horse. Zachary nearly collapsed as his feet touched the ground, saved only by Samuel's quick reflexes. "Trouble," he managed to say before his legs gave out entirely. "Martha," Samuel shouted toward the house. "Get out here and bring my medical bag." A woman appeared on the porch, took one look at the scene, and disappeared back inside, returning moments later with a black satchel. She rushed toward them, her face composed but her movements urgent. "Get him inside," she instructed her husband. "The guest room, you too," she added, turning to Madeline and Thomas. "Come along. You look half dead yourselves." Within minutes, they were inside the comfortable farmhouse. Zachary laid out on a bed in a small but clean room while Martha, who, it turned out, had been a nurse during the war, examined his wound with practiced efficiency. "Bullet went clean through," she reported, her hands gentle but firm as she cleaned the wound. "He's lost blood and there's infection starting, but if we can get the fever down, he should recover." Madeline, seated in a chair with her own ankle being tended by Samuel, felt relief wash over her so strongly she nearly fainted. "And this ankle is badly sprained, not broken," Samuel informed her. "Rest and cold compresses for a few days should set it right." Thomas, who had been hovering anxiously near Zachary's bedside, looked from the injured man to his mother. "Are we safe now, Mama?" he asked in a small voice. Samuel and Martha exchanged glances, clearly curious about the question. "Yes, my darling," Madeline assured her son. "We're safe now." Over a simple but nourishing meal, Madeline explained their situation to Samuel and Martha, who listened with growing concern and occasional outrage. "The Blackwoods," Samuel nodded grimly when she'd finished. "Their reputation extends even to these parts. Elias Blackwood has been buying up half of Wyoming territory for years, by fair means or foul. Jonahs will be looking for us," Madeline said, fear creeping back into her voice. "He knows Zach was helping us." "Let him come," Samuel said firmly. "This is Colorado territory, not Wyoming. And I've got friends in the U.S. Marshal's office who would be very interested in hearing about a sheriff colluding with murderers." Martha patted Madeline's hand reassuringly. "You're safe here, dear, both you and your boy, and Zach too, of course. That man's like a brother to Samuel." "How do you know him?" Madeline asked, curious about the connection between the rancher and the solitary trapper who had saved her life. "We fought together in the war," Samuel explained. "Saved each other's lives more times than we could count. Afterward, when I settled here with Martha, Zach headed north looking for solitude, I think. But he visits every year or so. He's a good man, one of the best." "Yes," Madeline agreed softly. "He is." The following days passed in a blur of anxiety and hope as Zachary battled the infection that had set into his wound. His fever spiked dangerously the second night, and Madeline sat beside his bed, bathing his forehead with cool water and whispering encouragements when he thrashed in delirium. "Don't leave me," she pleaded softly when Martha had stepped out to prepare more willow bark tea for the fever. "We've come too far, Zach. Thomas needs you." She hesitated, then admitted what she'd been feeling for weeks now. "I need you." Whether it was her words or Martha's capable nursing, Zachary's fever broke the following morning. He woke briefly, his eyes clear as they focused on Madeline dozing in the chair beside his bed. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice weak but lucid. Madeline started awake at the sound, her heart leaping when she saw him watching her. "Of course I am," she said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed, taking his hand in hers. "Where else would I be?" A small smile touched his lips. "Thought it might have been a dream," he admitted. "Finding you at my door that night, everything since." "Not a dream," she assured him, squeezing his hand gently. "Though there were moments it felt like a nightmare. But we made it," he said, his eyes holding hers, "just like I promised." "You nearly got yourself killed in the process," Madeline reminded him, her voice catching. "Don't ever do that again." "Yes, madam," he agreed with a weak attempt at his usual half-smile. Recovery was slow for both Zachary and Madeline, though Thomas flourished in the safe, stable environment of the ranch. Samuel's two sons, a few years older than Thomas, took the boy under their wing, teaching him to ride properly and including him in their daily chores and adventures. For the first time since her husband's death, Madeline saw her son truly happy, laughing, playing, being a child again without the shadow of fear that had hung over him for so long. It eased something in her heart that had been tight with worry for weeks. As Zachary regained his strength, he and Madeline spent long hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence as she read to him from books borrowed from Samuel's modest library. The easy companionship they had begun to develop during their journey deepened into something more profound, a mutual understanding and respect that formed the foundation of deeper feelings. A week after their arrival, Samuel returned from a trip to town with significant news. "The territorial marshal has been informed about Jonah's Blackwood," he told them over dinner. "It seems Sheriff Davis didn't die immediately. A trapper found him near the burned cabin, still breathing. Davis lived long enough to sign a deposition about what really happened to your husband, Madeline, and to Zach." "So Jonas will be arrested?" Madeline asked, hardly daring to hope. "A warrant's been issued," Samuel confirmed, "and not just for him. His father's implicated too, for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The marshal believes this might finally break the Blackwoods' hold on Utica and the surrounding area." The news was like a physical weight lifting from Madeline's shoulders. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly believe that the danger was past, that she and Thomas might have a future free from the shadow of fear. That night, as she sat with Zachary on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and pink, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. "What happens now?" she asked softly, echoing the question she'd posed in the trapper's cabin what felt like a lifetime ago. Zachary, his arm still in a sling but healing well, turned to look at her. "That still depends on you," he said, "but I meant what I said before. I want you and Thomas to come back with me, to make a home together." Madeline studied his face in the fading light, the strong features she had come to know so well, the blue eyes that could be as hard as steel in danger but were now soft with an emotion she was no longer afraid to name. "I want that too," she admitted, "but there's something I need to do first." Zachary raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I need to go back to Utica," she explained. "Not to stay, just to collect whatever might be left of our old life, to say goodbye properly." "Thomas deserves that closure, and so do I," Zachary nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, "and I'll go with you when we're both strong enough to travel." "You don't have to," Madeline began, but Zachary interrupted her by taking her hand. "Yes, I do," he said simply. "We started this journey together, and we'll finish it the same way." 2 weeks later, when both were sufficiently recovered, they made the journey back to Utica. Samuel accompanied them, his presence as a respected rancher and former lawman providing an extra measure of security. The town looked smaller than Madeline remembered, less intimidating now that the Blackwoods' influence was crumbling. Jonas was in custody awaiting trial, and Elias Blackwood had reportedly fled to avoid arrest, leaving his business interests in disarray. Their old home still stood, though it had been ransacked in their absence. Madeline walked through the rooms, memories both good and painful surrounding her. Thomas remained close to Zachary, reluctant to explore what had once been familiar territory. There wasn't much worth salvaging, a few photographs, William's pocket watch that had somehow been overlooked by the looters, a small wooden box containing the few pieces of jewelry Madeline had inherited from her mother. These she gathered carefully, along with Thomas's favorite wooden soldiers that had been abandoned in their flight. Before leaving Utica for the last time, they visited William's grave. The town had buried him in the small cemetery, a simple marker all that indicated his final resting place. Madeline stood silent for a long moment, her hand on Thomas's shoulder, as she said her private farewell to the man she had married in hope and left in terror. "Thank you for bringing us here," she told Zachary as they walked away, her heart lighter for having made peace with the past. "It's important to honor what came before," he replied, his hand finding hers naturally, "even as we look toward what's ahead." The return journey to Zachary's cabin in Wyoming was markedly different from their desperate flight in the opposite direction. They traveled openly, at an easy pace that accommodated their still healing injuries, enjoying the changing landscape and each other's company. When they finally crested the ridge that overlooked Zachary's property, Madeline felt a surge of emotion she hadn't expected, a sense of homecoming that brought tears to her eyes. The cabin stood just as they had left it, sturdy and welcoming in the afternoon sun. Zachary reined his horse to a stop, looking at Madeline and Thomas with an uncharacteristic uncertainty in his expression. "Is it what you remember?" he asked Thomas, who nodded enthusiastically. "It's better," the boy declared. "Can I go see the horses?" "In a little while," Zachary promised. "First, there's something I need to ask your mother." He dismounted, then helped Madeline down from her horse, keeping hold of her hands as she stood before him. The intensity in his eyes made her heart quicken. "Madeline Foster," he said formally, "I know we haven't known each other long in the usual way of things, but I think we've lived a lifetime together these past weeks. I know your heart and your courage, and you know mine." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I love you." "I love Thomas too, as if he were my own son. I want to build a life with both of you, right here." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, producing a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it since she died, waiting for the right woman to give it to. I never thought I'd find her, especially after Emily passed. But then you knocked on my door that night and everything changed." Madeline's eyes filled with tears as he continued. "Will you marry me, Madeline? Will you make this place a home again, with your laughter and your strength and your love?" Thomas had dismounted and now stood watching them, his small face serious but hopeful. "Say yes, Mama," he urged quietly. "Please." Madeline laughed through her tears, looking from her son to the man who had risked everything to save them, who had opened his heart and his home when they needed it most. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Zachary Taylor, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Thomas whooped with delight, rushing to join them in an embrace that encompassed all three of them, a family formed in the crucible of danger and hardship, but bound now by something stronger than any adversity. The wedding took place a month later, a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher with Samuel and Martha as witnesses. Madeline wore a new dress of pale blue, Thomas stood proudly at his mother's side, and Zachary could not take his eyes off his bride throughout the brief service. "I never thought I'd have this again," he confessed to her that night as they lay together in what was now their shared bed. "A family, a purpose beyond just surviving." "Nor did I," Madeline admitted, her head resting on his chest, listening to the strong heartbeat that had become her sanctuary. "After William died, I thought Thomas and I would be running forever. I never imagined finding safety, let alone love." "Well, Mrs. Taylor," Zachary said, tilting her face up for a kiss, "you found both." "And so did you," she reminded him, returning his kiss with a passion that still surprised her in its intensity. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and strangely familiar. Zachary taught Thomas to ride properly, to fish, to identify the tracks of animals in the forest surrounding their home. Madeline planted a garden, expanded the chicken coop, and began putting up preserves for the winter ahead. Together, they added a room to the cabin for Thomas, and Zachary spoke of building another for the baby they hoped would come in time. They made plans and dreamed dreams, each day a gift neither had expected to receive. Word reached them eventually that Jonas Blackwood had been convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. While his father remained a fugitive, his empire crumbled to dust in his absence. The news brought a final closure to the dark chapter of their lives, allowing them to look forward without the shadow of the past looming over them. 5 years later, the cabin had expanded into a proper home, with additional rooms for the two daughters who had joined their family, Emily, named for Zachary's first wife, and Rose, for Madeline's mother. Thomas, now 11, had grown tall and strong under Zachary's guidance, with his mother's quiet determination and his stepfather's integrity. On a warm summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard, Zachary took Madeline's hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band that had not left her finger since the day he'd placed it there. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. Knocking on a stranger's door that night, Madeline smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as she watched Thomas teaching little Emily to throw a ball, Rose toddling after them on chubby legs. "Never," she answered truthfully. "Thomas found the right stranger that night, just as you said." She turned to meet his gaze, still moved by the love she saw there after all this time. And so did I. In the golden light of sunset, surrounded by the family they had built together from the most unlikely beginnings, Zachary's kiss was both a memory of all they had overcome and a promise of all that still lay ahead, a love story written not in grand gestures but in small moments of courage, kindness, and faith, the most powerful magic of all.